Mine's a cost-benefit analysis, a skeptic's perspective, and the skeptical part is both about the costs are generally understated and the benefits are generally overstated. So my disclaimer here, my company, RCP, specializes in helping pipeline operators comply with complicated federal and state regulations. That's my business. Right, so it's easy to argue that, hey, the more complicated the rule is, hey, the better it is for me. So I certainly wouldn't argue that. You know, I should write thank you notes to PHMSA on a regular basis because, you know, geez, it just has worked out better than I would have ever guessed. And I also, just for people that haven't connected a face with a name, if you're on the Safe Pipelines news group, which I recommend highly, I'm Bill. Okay, so I frequently am commenting, you know, from the industry perspective, but just to be absolutely clear, I'm not here speaking on behalf of any industry member or industry association, and I don't do that on Safe Pipelines either. So if I say something stupid on Safe Pipelines, it's on me, right? It's not anybody else's fault. So like I said, clearly the more complicated the regulation, the better it is for my business. But frankly, I feel like an undertaker during the plague, and it doesn't matter how much I try to improve health and safety, I'm going to have plenty of business. So you might be asking yourself, why am I making this presentation? And I've scratched my head on that a lot, and the only answer I can come up with is I am stupid. So I'm just working against my best interests. Just to be clear, I have great respect for Mr. Gale and all the other people at PHMSA and throughout the government that they're tasked with the very unpleasant prospect of having to actually quantify all those unquantifiable benefits and unquantifiable costs and try to figure out, you know, how many polar bears are worth one serious injury, and it's like, you know, there's no right answer to that, right? I appreciate that, and so I certainly understand that they have a job that nobody can ever do perfectly. That doesn't mean I can't criticize it in the next few minutes. Okay, so so there's a French economist in the 1800s, Frederick Bastiat, and he's got a number of famous quotes. You've probably seen some of them, and he's got this one small essay on the seen and the unseen. And he's talking about the profession of economics and how the good economist, you know, doesn't stop at the seen impacts of a particular action. You know, so it's easy to quantify the direct cost and the direct benefits. He said, but you can't stop there. You have to think, what else is going to happen because this changed? You know, what are the secondary costs, the tertiary costs, you know, and maybe what are the secondary benefits and the tertiary benefits, you know. It's hard to predict those, and even rooms full of experts will likely come up with different predictions. But still, just because they're hard to quantify doesn't mean they aren't potentially large. And I think that goes on both sides of the equation, right? Maybe those hard to quantify benefits are actually very, very large, you just couldn't put a number on them. I'll argue a lot of those unquantified costs could also be very, very large. And just because you can't quantify them doesn't mean that they aren't you know, very real and potentially crippling. So what I've got a picture here, you can't really read that, which is good. But what you could, if you could read it, you would see that it is a check I just received last week from my health savings account bank, the provider, you know, that manages all the funds from my health savings account. And it's a refund check for 1 cent. 1 cent. Okay, because there are strict government guidelines on how much money you can contribute to your health savings account every year. And apparently, because some computer program somewhere rounded up, I ended up contributing 1 penny too much. Okay, so what happened as a result of that? Well, number one, they had to have a computer program somewhere in their system that realized that, oh God, this is over by 1 penny. You know, if I get audited, you know, what fraction of my accounts are going to be out of compliance? They couldn't have that, so they sent me a letter in the Postal Service, right? That cost me at least $1.50. And explaining the situation to me, wanted me to recalculate all the numbers and make sure they got everything right. I got to do all that. Okay, it takes me a while to do that. Then I got to mail the letter back to them, so I mail the letter back to them. And then they sent me another letter. I'm not quite so sure why they sent me this one, but they sent me a letter specifically to let me know that I was going to get a 1-cent check in the mail. So it's like, okay, that's great. So sure enough, the next week, I get my 1-cent check. And I figured I'd do everybody a favor and not cash that check, because if I did, everybody's going to have to pay more money. The bank's going to have to process it and all that stuff. And I'd rather use it for show and tell anyway. Okay, so I'm just going to hang on to it. But ask yourself, how would you calculate the cost of that particular thing? Well, in one strict accounting method, you could say, well, the cost was zero. It was my money to begin with. They gave me my money back. There's no direct cost. It's like, oh, but there's lots of costs, right? There's at least the postage. And not to count, all the people that had to process the paperwork on their end and me on my end, checking all the numbers and, refilling out all the forms and all the cussing that was involved. And, it just takes time. So, so that's just one trivial example of how something that seems like it'd be really easy and probably doesn't get quantified at all actually has a lot of indirect cost associated with it. So let's get to number one. Like I said, I'm not here to speak on behalf of any industry player or association, but Sarah suggested that we try to focus some of our efforts around the pending proposed rule. So I'm just going to give a few of my thoughts, not anybody else's thoughts. So some of the items in this proposed rule and the associated costs that were identified in the rulemaking. Reporting for gravity pipelines. Now, I'll admit, I didn't even know there were really any gravity pipelines out there until I started reading this rulemaking. But they estimate that the total cost for that provision is $900, industry-wide. And it's like, we're going to spend at least $9 grand just reading that to make sure it doesn't apply to us, right? You know that. So it's a trivial number. Who really cares if it's 900 or 9,000? But it's like, you're missing an awful lot of cost just on the very first item. The next one, expanding the list of conditions, or number 6, that require immediate repair. And I quote, the impact of that was minimal cost. If you've ever had to deal with an immediate repair condition on a pipeline, you would be the first one to realize that's not even close to minimal, right? I mean, you got customer impacts, you've got operational impacts, you may have overtime, it always happens on a weekend or a holiday. You're going to have tons of costs associated with any additional immediate repair condition. So like I said earlier, just because it's hard to quantify doesn't mean it isn't really real. Or number 7, requiring any pipeline that can affect an HCA to be capable of handling inline inspection. And they calculated that as $1 million a year. And I'm like, this person never was a project engineer for a pipeline company, right? Because try to plan a project as big as that, because that's a significant project for $1 million. And your boss will laugh you out of the room, right? You can't do that. Some digs cost $1 million. And to make a pipeline that's not currently capable of handling inline inspection to be capable of inline inspection, well, let me just tell you, if it was easy, they would have already done it. Yeah, we agree. We like inline inspection. The liquids industry runs lots and lots of inline inspection tools. And, so pipes have been modified over the years to handle inline inspection tools. But still, there's some out there that can't currently handle inline inspection tools. They're not the $1 million conversion pipelines, right? So that's just another example of how, wow, I look at these costs and I don't think they're off by 10%. I think a lot of them are off by an order of magnitude. A practical example, something that maybe everybody in the room can relate to. The IRS calculates how long they think it's going to take you to do your taxes every year. They got a number. So what do you think, on average, the number is You know, when you've got to read all those forms, let's just say you do it yourself. You know, reading all those forms and then figuring out, wow, did I have a capital gain or loss that I got to, you know, account for separately this year? You know, my healthcare deductions, did they exceed some limit? Maybe I can deduct some of those, maybe I can't, you know. God forbid you sold a house or got a new mortgage or refinanced. You know, somebody in your family died. You know, there are estate issues. Lord knows how long that takes to figure out. Dependents, did you gain some? Did you lose some? You know, the list goes on and on and on, right? I'm just scratching the surface here. You know, my point is that the IRS regulations affect every single thing you do. So how long does that take overall? And by the way, the IRS has, on average, 16 hours a year, which actually I thought, well, that's a pretty good number, but that's an average number. Trust you know, as a small business owner, you know, 16 doesn't even scratch the surface there either. I wouldn't even begin to try to do it myself. You know, that's what the accountants are for. But their time counts too, right? But let's just say you're an average person, 16 hours a year. That's 2 full work days every year out of your life. Would you rather have those back, right? So those costs are real and they're significant. So I'll wrap up with this presentation, kind of bringing home my picture of my son. You know, he wanted to know what to grow up and be, and it's like, you should be a tax accountant, and that's what he is. So I say he has the most secure profession in the world because, you know, other than the undertaker's job, you know, being the tax accountant is good, but my business is almost as secure as his. Because government regulations, no matter how well they're done, are never going to go away, and thankfully they're going to need consultants to help them with it. So that's all my thanks.